This, as I've said from the very outset, is a course in the history of Islamic society. It seems a truism that you cannot have an Islamic society unless you have a lot of Muslims. So, crucial to the concept of a social history of Islam is explaining where did all those Muslims come from. And that is why I'm going to talk today, and depending on how things go, maybe beginning of next week, on how you study the growth of a religious community with a quantitative frame of mind instead of a doctrinal or institutional frame of mind. That is to say, I'm interested not in what beliefs the people had or did not have, or how they organized themselves. I'm just interested in the first instance in how many Muslims there were and when people became Muslims. Oddly enough, considering the importance of religion in history, the study of religious conversion has proceeded very, very slowly and has relied upon largely unreliable documentation. That is to say, if you read the history of conversion to Christianity in Europe, most of the books will talk about missionaries who went someplace. Saint so-and-so goes to Flanders and converts the Flemish. And of course, you have to wonder, how many Flemish did he meet? And how loud was his voice? And did everyone who heard him convert? And how did he know that they converted? You can have some instances, for example, when Charlemagne defeated the Saxons, he baptized all the survivors. Well, okay, so you can count baptisms, but is that really a conversion? And what does it mean to convert from one religion to another? What you can observe is that at any given point in time, you can say there are certain people who self-identify as belonging to this religious community as opposed to that religious community, and it is fairly uncommon for someone to claim that they belong to two religious communities. It does occur, but it's normally religious community membership is a zero-sum situation. You're either in this or you're in that. The question of how you converted to Islam stands out because it is different from the notion of baptism, where you have a ritual that people undergo. In Islam, there is no ritual. You must utter the confession of faith. That is to say, you must say in Arabic, there is no God but God. Muhammad is the messenger of God. And as people elaborate on that notion, they say, well, you should say it twice, and you should say it in your heart, not simply with your voice. There was no cardiometer to measure whether words were being uttered in the heart or not, so this was a aspirational concept rather than one that could be implemented. And in fact, we know that there was a con game in the 9th century, or actually in the 10th century, of men who would go from one community to another, one city to another, and they would enter the city. Usually they would have a confederate with them, and they would be dressed as Jews and wearing whatever paraphernalia was associated in that locality with being a Jew, and then their confederate would come up to them in the street and say, "You, Jew, I call on you to convert to Islam." And he would say, "Look, here's this Jew. He'll convert to Islam if we can only show him the benefit he will gain from converting to Islam." So he passes the turban, and people throw in their dinars and their dirhams, and pretty soon there's a pile of money. All he has to do, and so they give him Muslim clothing. He takes off his Jewish clothing, dresses as a Muslim, utters the testament that there's no God but God, and Muhammad is messenger of God, and he gets the money. Then he and his confederate disappear, go out in the country, split the money, go to the next city, and do it all over again. So we know that there were that this was a common enough con game that there was a special underworld term for people who did this. We have a very useful 10th century poem that lists the terms used by people in the underworld for con games of this sort. So we know that there were inauthentic conversions. We have very little information about specific conversions. And this is partly because the verb aslama in Arabic, which means to become Muslim, is also the verb to surrender. So that you'll have a battle, and it will say that the defenders aslama, did they surrender or did they become Muslims? And in the tales of the conquest period, it's often very ambiguous as to whether, when you see this verb being deployed, whether we are talking about changing religion or simply surrendering to the army of the Arabs. There are a few stories of individuals who converted. I've found something like half a dozen, but they're very rare in the early period, and they tend to be formulaic in the sense that they use a phrase that someone uttered the profession of faith between the hands of so-and-so, fi yaday fulan. And this between the hands of suggests that conversion in these specific anecdotes occurred when some non-Muslim, in the presence of a specific Muslim, uttered the profession of faith. And these rare stories appear to be related to the social status of the convert, so that you are showing a kind of relationship between the convert and the person between whose hands the conversion took place. And occasionally you'll have something that is more illuminating. A man goes to a Muslim and says, who is the most important Muslim? I want to convert to Islam. He says, well, you'll have to go to Syria where the caliph is. And so he eventually makes his way through a number of stages of getting more and more important Muslims. He finally gets to Damascus where the caliph is, and he says, are you the most important person in Islam? And he says, yes. Well, then I convert between your hands. And the point of this was to show the eminence of the convert, that he is not someone who would convert to just any old Muslim, but he has to go and find out who's the boss Muslim. But there are so few stories that deal with individual conversions, at least in the first 3 centuries, that you can't get a picture of this. In the absence of explicit statements, there has been a succession of theories about when people became Muslims. The first theory, which you still run across, particularly in Islamophobic environments, is that because the Quran says that you must fight the unbelievers until they convert to Islam or you kill them, they have concluded that all the people who converted to Islam were people who were given a choice between conversion or death. It's conversion by the sword. We don't have much in the way of specific instances of this occurring, but one of the implications of this theory was that conversion occurred during the conquest period. So if the main conquests are completed by 711, as I've suggested they were, because that's when the armies get to Spain and to southern Pakistan, that would suggest that it's the first century of Islam that saw people converting to the new faith. This got built into a lot of European historiography. There was a very famous book by a Belgian historian named Henri Pirenne called Muhammad and Charlemagne. And he said, well, when the Arabs conquered, you had this sort of, I don't know, iron curtain, maybe we could call it an iron hijab, dropping between the Christians on the north side of the Mediterranean and the Muslims on the south side, because now they were all Muslims in the south and all Christians in the north. But of course they weren't all Muslims in the south. They simply were people who had a Muslim government. And this theory has been pretty much discarded over a century of research into the history of relations between the north and south sides of the Mediterranean. So then you had a second theory that really dates from the 1950s, and that said that you have two different types of taxation in Islam. You have one called kharaj, and this is a tax on the produce of arable land, and it is owed not according to who owns the land, but rather what portion of the crop should be paid to the government in the form of a tax. And then the other tax is a jizya, and the jizya was a tax that was charged on a per capita basis only on non-Muslims, specifically on people of the book, Arabic phrase, Ahl Kitab, people who were considered to have been beneficiaries of God's revelations before Muhammad, primarily Christians and Jews, but by a sort of courtesy, including Zoroastrians in Iran. The Ahl Kitab were people who, according to Quranic stricture, are to be protected within a Muslim community. And there is a precedent for this that goes back to the time of the Prophet in a agreement that may or may not be actually genuine. Most people, I think, feel it's one of the few early documents that probably is genuine. An agreement between Muhammad and the tribes in Medina when he moved there in 622, in which the Jews became protected, and the Jews who lived in Medina and were associated with the Arab tribes. That protection turned out to be hollow because in a series of incidents, the Jews are regarded as being disloyal and therefore not worthy of protection, and they were either driven out of Medina or, in the final case, killed. But the principle of the Muslim state protecting people of the book is a very early one. And that protection is called dhimma, so that people who are beneficiaries of the protection are called dhimmis. The protection is conceived of as being defended by the armies of the Muslim state, so that the non-Muslims, after the period of the first few decades of the conquest, during which you did have Christian Arab tribes participating in the Arab armies, by the time you get to the early 8th century, the armies consist of Arab Muslims, and the Christians are gradually sort of extruded from the army, and the Jews and the Christians, Zoroastrians, do not, from that time on, have military service. In return, they pay a tax, this jizya, that is, at least symbolically, represents the protection they enjoy in a Muslim state. In the middle of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire terminated the jizya because they were trying to become a modern state, which made all of the Christians in the Ottoman Empire liable to be drafted. So once they terminated the jizya, then they instituted a tax that you could pay in order to avoid military service, and the tax is the same amount as the jizya. So, we're really talking here about something relating primarily to military service. It's often interpreted as relating primarily to second-class citizenship, so that the distinction between Muslims and non-Muslims is one of constrained behaviors for the non-Muslims and freedom of behavior for the Muslims. The evidence of this being done regularly and systematically is fairly weak, although it certainly occurred at certain places, at certain times when you had special costumes that were required of non-Muslims. Many of the earliest strictures of this sort seem to relate not so much to Muslims as to Arabs, so that you will have something saying the non-Muslims cannot wear their hair the way the Arabs wear their hair, rather than saying the way the Muslims wear their hair. Or they cannot, if they want to say so-and-so the son of so-and-so, they're not allowed to use ibn, meaning son of. And this is really Arabic language. It has nothing to do with, ostensibly nothing to do with religion. Instead, they use the word walid, which means son of. So there appears to have been a concern about distinguishing Muslims from non-Muslims on a behavioral basis. But all these distinctions were not necessarily related to an idea of humiliating non-Muslims. One thing that's frequently pointed out is that Christians were not allowed to ring bells. Typically, at that time, Christians didn't use bells. There's no bells in the Bible. Bells are not used in the time of the apostles. There are no early bells in Christianity, and when you ask historians of Christianity, when did people start having church bells? They really are very vague on it. They say, well, now there was a bell that sort of, tied it to your ankle or something, or around the neck of a sheep. I mean, they had bells, but we're talking bells here. And when did the idea of a big bell come? And it seems fairly clear that the notion that churches have bells was not commonplace at the time of the prophet. Instead, someone would go out with a resonant piece of wood and hit the piece of wood. So you'd have a clacker that would call people to prayer. So when you look at the surviving lists of behavioral restrictions, which are of very uncertain date, it sometimes is difficult to determine the degree to which these constituted humiliating things. Non-Muslims are not allowed to ride horses. But in fact, Muslims didn't ride horses either unless they're in the army, because horses were primarily a military animal. If you were a man of religion and a Muslim, you rode either a donkey or a mule. There's no prohibition on non-Muslims riding donkeys or mules, just horses. Anyway, the point of all this is that there was a tax. The character of the tax is unclear. What exactly the tax signified is unclear. The literal meaning of the tax in the earliest texts is ambiguous. But in the 50s, the idea spread that people converted to Islam to avoid paying a tax. And this seemed to be fairly clear to a man named Daniel Dennett, who was the primary expositor of this thesis. And that would again associate conversion with the establishment of Muslim government. Maybe not the conquest immediately, but let us say in the century that succeeded the conquest, that is when the taxes would become more or less fixed, and that is then when people should have converted. So we moved from a situation where you had conversion in the 1st century to perhaps conversion in the 2nd century. There were problems with this. First, we didn't have any examples of anyone converting in order to avoid the tax. Secondly, there was a question as to whether a tax benefit or a tax penalty actually compels people en masse to change their practices. It's been observed that the US tax code benefits single people over married couples in certain ways, and yet we have not had a mass wave of divorce in order to save a few bucks on taxes. So this was a shaky theory. I'm putting out these theories of whether it's in the 1st century of Islam or the 2nd century of Islam or in what century of Islam you have the main thrust of conversion. These are fairly important issues because you are talking about a period during which many of the most fundamental roots of Muslim institutions and Muslim philosophy, law, religious organization, these things are being started during these first 2 centuries. And were these things started in a society that was a mass society of Muslims? Or were they started before there was a mass society of Muslims? In order to go at this from a different direction, I decided to explore a quantitative method that has been very largely accepted in its results, even though most of the people who accept the results either cannot follow or choose not to follow the reasoning that led to the results. So now you'll find that most often it's written in history books that conversion to Islam was greatest in the sort of late 800s down to 1000 for the Middle East and North Africa, rather than in the 1st or the 2nd century. I want to explain why I got this result. And this has to do with thinking about the nature of personal names. Personal names in societies that do not have specific laws restricting the naming that can be undertaken. Personal names constitute one of the very few exercises of free choice that humans ever have. They get to name their children, and the children can't do a damn thing about it, and nobody else cares. And because it's an act of free will, it's incredibly difficult to choose names for children. People are not used to exercising freedom. They're used to saying, well, it's, Romney or Obama. I mean, there's a choice, but it's not an unconfined choice. And yet here you can pick any name you want in this country and, burden your child with it. The names that I had at my disposal were overwhelmingly male names, and I would argue that traditionally parents have invested more in thinking about the future careers of sons than of daughters. So I think male names are more diagnostic than female names. That may not be so true right now. It is widely apparent that people who convert to Islam adopt Arabic names or adopt names that they think of as Muslim names. This is how we explain half the names in the National Football League. So that these come somehow from a Muslim background because we've had this phenomenal wave of naming change in the African American community over the last 30 years or so. But it may be that many of the people who are called, Kareem or Rashad or so forth are not Muslims. I don't know, but they have names that are in Arabic. So the question is, when you name a son, you could name the son for a popular figure, Brad. Let's name our son Brad because we want him to look like Brad Pitt or something. Or you might name him Barack. That's a good name. Well, I won't go into any other names, but you could pick a popular name or a voguish name. You could pick a name that's the name of one of your relatives. And in some communities, the idea of naming for a recently deceased relative, or at least having the first initial of a recently deceased relative, is fairly common. But once let's say that these things more or less balance out these small tendencies of popularity or lack of popularity. In a broader sense, if you look at masses of names, it looks as though people are anticipating what kind of name would be good for a son during the course of his lifetime. My father was named Leander. He was the fourth generation of Leanders in his family. None of them ever used the name Leander. My mother was dominant in my family, and she certainly was not going to have a son named Leander. So she said, I want a common, ordinary American name. Not ever guessing that the nickname would become an obscene term for most of my adult life. Nor I don't think she was even aware it became an obscene term. But the anticipation is not necessarily borne out. I think you could probably find statistically that the number of people who are christened Adolf in Europe and America is fairly small even now, because there are negative connotations with that name. But people who converted to Islam either changed their name or gave a Muslim name to their son. And this apparently was part of identifying with the Muslim community. After all, if you are going to be called Muhammad, people are going to think you're a Muslim. And if you're going to be called Rostam, people will think you're not a Muslim. That's a good Persian name from the Book of Kings. In medieval Islamic culture, for reasons that I will talk about at a later point, it became common for scholars to collect the names of all of the people they studied under, and then other scholars to come along, take books that had all these names in them, and collate them into massive collections of lists of names of scholars, people under whom individuals had studied. These are collected in what we call biographical dictionaries, although most of the entries are so abbreviated they don't really constitute a biography, but you do have the name itself. And the name has a number of parts, because this is characteristic of medieval Arabic naming. So you have a first name, and say a given name. And that in Arabic is called an ism. Then you have a name that designates a son, and that'll be preceded by Abu something, Abu Muhammad, the father of Muhammad. If it's a woman, it'll be Muhammad, the mother of Muhammad. And that name that starts with either Abu or is called a kunya. Originally, someone did not have a kunya until they had offspring. But by the 3rd century, and even perhaps the 2nd century, it became common that you would give the ism and the kunya to a child because there would be assonance. There would be the sense these sound good together. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the person will have a son who actually has that name, particularly people of non-Arab background. Then you have a series of names that are the name of the father, the grandfather, the great-grandfather, as far back as you choose to go. And that genealogy is called a nesab. Then you have one or more names that relate you to something, relate you to a job, or relate you to a location, or relate you to some distinctive thing about your lineage. And this is roughly the equivalent of what we would call a last name. And that relational adjective is called a nisba. If you take say 5,000 entries in biographical dictionaries, and you look at the names, you could say, well, 1, 2, let's say 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7. 7 names times 5,000 entries, you've got about 35,000 names that you're looking at, because you're not looking just at the name of the person, but you're looking at all the names in the genealogy. Now, it turned out that for Iran, where adopting an Arabic name meant changing language, you could say the same thing about Syria or Iraq, except that Aramaic and Arabic are close enough together that you don't have a reliable, clear distinction between an Arabic name and an Aramaic name. In Egypt, non-Arabic names are rather scarce. Exactly what happened with Egyptian naming, I don't know, but then we don't have biographical dictionaries extensively from Egypt. We have most of them from Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Spain. If you look at these 35,000 names, and that's roughly the number that was involved in the research I did, you'll find that there are almost no names in the Persian language. Virtually every name is in Arabic. When a Persian name, at least down until 1100, maybe 1150, then you start to get Persian names returning. When Persian names do occur, almost all of them occur as the earliest name in a nesab, in a series of names. And so you'll have a Persian name, the son of Arabic name, the father of Arabic name, the father of Arabic name, father of Arabic name, and he's the one who's in the biographical dictionary. So you have a series of, I could extract from these biographical entries, a series of genealogies that began with a Persian name and then switched to Arabic. And I hypothesize that that's when you had the conversion. That the Persian name was either the first convert or the father of the first convert. So could one make an estimate then of when that person lived? Well, if you had a date for this individual, and there were ways, sometimes the date is given in the biography or the person will fall into a category that can be dated, at least roughly. Then you could say, well, the length of a generation is, let's say, 36 years. That was a number that came out of collecting a lot of death dates of fathers and sons, subtracting the death date of the, or the length of life of the, well, subtracting the death date of the father from the death date of the son, you got the number of years of length of a generation. And you get enough examples and you have a fairly good notion of how long a generation was. Remember that that medieval Arab, well, medieval Muslim men typically propagated children over a fairly long series of years. So 36 years or 35 years would be the midpoint in the person's siring of children. So if you count backwards, 1 generation, 2 generation, 3 generation, 4 generation, then you're able to produce a hypothetical date for when that first person in the genealogy lived. Once you've collected these genealogies and dated the point of the name change, then you can distribute them over a time curve. And what you get is this curve. A very regular, sort of stretched out S shape. This in statistics is known as a logistic curve. What it is the normal distribution curve, the bell-shaped curve that you all have known about ever since grading began. And what you do is that if you take all of the areas underneath the curve and you add them, this is what you get. This. You're adding the areas underneath the curve instead of having them as separate